Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History, and I'm here today with Henry.
Hello.
And welcome to our next Vice Presidential Series installment, as we're taking a look at the guy behind us, right, Henry?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and what's his name?
HenryAWallace, the 33rd Vice President of the United States.
He's right. That's HenryAWallace, the 33rd Vice President of the United States. We have some cool things to tell you about HenryAWallace. But first, before we get into our 33rd Vice President, Henry, what do the people have to do?
Hit subscribe down below, leave all your comments and questions, drop a like, give a thumbs up, and leave your comments and questions.
Hey, you gotta repeat it yourself, but he's right. Hit subscribe down below, leave all those comments and questions, we love those. Give us a like and a thumbs up.
And then hit that little notification bell.
You got it, that's right. And then hit the little notification bell so you can be notified when we do release a new video. And Henry, when is it?
Every single week.
It's every single week, he's right. So here we go. Our next Vice Presidential Series installment, the 33rd Vice President, HenryAWallace. And this is...
Dead History.
Dead History. Hey guys, how's it going? TJ back with you, here with Henry.
Hello.
And yeah, the guy behind us is HenryAWallace. The what number, Henry?
33rd Vice President.
The 33rd Vice President of the United States. Some cool things to tell you today about HenryAWallace, such as he was actually at one point Secretary of Agriculture, and I believe he was the Secretary of Commerce too at one point. Another really cool thing about him, he actually was born in Iowa.
Is this heaven? It's Iowa.
Yeah, he was like a farm boy. So, born in Iowa, very interesting. He's actually buried in Iowa too, at a very modest, small gravesite. I'm going to show you that, of course, because I visited there. And HenryAWallace, let's see, Henry, let's see if you got it. Who was he vice president under?
Franklin Roosevelt.
Well, very good, yeah. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, for Franklin Roosevelt's third term. Yeah, the first two were our previous vice president who we just did, John Nance Garner. So now HenryAWallace under the third term of FDR was vice president. Pretty cool. He also, HenryAWallace, the man with your name, Henry, he also ran as the Progressive Party candidate, or nominee, I should say, in, I believe it was 1948, the presidential election. So he was also an unsuccessful presidential candidate, which is kind of cool. So there you go. So here we go. Lots of cool stuff to tell you about HenryAWallace, 33rd Vice President. They did the likes. Hopefully they're subscribing. They're leaving the comments and questions. They did it all. Henry, I mean, go ahead. What do they got to go get?
Go get the potato chips, the pretzels, the anything you want.
Popcorn. We just had for dessert M&M McFlurries from McDonald's. Yep, go get it all. Whatever you like to snack on, whatever you like to drink, go get it. Because here we go. Next Vice Presidential Series installment number 33rd Vice President of the United States,
HenryAWallace.
HenryAWallace. Sit back, relax,
And
enjoy. Hey guys, welcome. TJ here with Dead History, and welcome to our next Vice Presidential Series installment as we're taking a look at the 33rd Vice President of the United States, HenryAWallace. HenryAWallace, of course, our next Vice President here that we're featuring this week. I am flying solo, with there may be a guest appearance from Mr. Henry. We'll have to see. But for now, I'm flying solo for the audio here. Of course, part one today, we're going to take a look at the early life, education, the political rise, all the way up to his vice presidency of HenryAWallace's. And then tomorrow, part two, we'll take a look at his vice presidency, legacy, death, gravesite, all that stuff, of course. Same format as always. Same time, same channel, just a different subject. That's the way it goes. So, just maybe one quick announcement. I'm not going to tell you the exact date yet, because I'm still firming up everything. But in April, because tomorrow is April 1st already, in April there will be a Dead History Trivia Night Part 2. So we will have a Dead History Trivia Night live, a special live stream on this YouTube channel. It is going to be in April. It is going to be a Friday night in April. And I will tell you this, it's going to be later on in the month. So it's not any time real soon. Still have a few weeks. But it is going to be a Friday night in April. So be on the lookout on our Instagram page at Dead History 1776 on Instagram. Be on the lookout there for our announcement, and even the announcement, I'll put it on here too as well on the YouTube channel. So that's one brief thing I wanted to mention. And there you go. Let's just jump right in now to our 33rd Vice President, Henry Wallace. Here we go. HenryAWallace is usually remembered for the events that followed his tenure as Vice President, particularly for his resounding defeat as a third-party candidate for the presidency on the communist-tainted Progressive Party ticket in 1948. Yet during the 3 decades prior to his political demise in 1948, Wallace had a highly successful public career, of which his term as vice president during U.S. participation in World War II was something of a culmination. As vice president, he set modern historical precedent by playing a real administrative role in government. He also gained worldwide notoriety during his vice presidential years as a champion of international political and economic democracy, calling for what he termed the century of the common man. Through the 1910s, 1920s, and early 1930s, the decades before he became vice president, Wallace was a highly successful agricultural scientist, as well as an influential farm editor and Midwestern agrarian spokesman. He was also a central participant in Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal as Secretary of Agriculture, overseeing what are considered some of the most successful programs of the New Deal years. Despite Wallace's very real successes, from the time he began his political career in 1933, he was often attacked as an impractical, starry-eyed idealist. These attacks were augmented during the 1948 presidential campaign by widespread assertions that Wallace was a dupe of the Communist Party, and later by the general cultural climate of the early Cold War years and the McCarthy era. Such characterizations also gained impetus from persistent rumors of Wallace's actual interests in different forms of spiritualism. Wallace's reputation, both contemporary and historical, was probably damaged as well by an awkward, somewhat distant personality. Indeed, by nature, he was not a politician at all. He was rather a reformer and, to a great degree, a visionary. No matter what he does, it is always going to seem faintly ridiculous. And no matter how he acts, it is always going to seem faintly pathetic. At least to the cold-eyed judgments of the Hill. Alan Drury. Prefaced by the stormy Democratic nominating convention of 1940, the vice presidency of Henry A. Wallace concluded with the equally tempestuous 1944 convention. In 1940, when Vice President John Nance Garner broke with President Franklin D. Roosevelt and withdrew to Texas, Roosevelt designated Wallace as his running mate over the considerable objection of many convention delegates. 4 years later, in 1944, Roosevelt jettisoned Wallace in favor of Harry S. Truman, who then succeeded to the presidency following Roosevelt's death. During his single term, Henry Wallace became more involved in administrative and foreign policy matters than any of his predecessors. Although widely judged a failure as vice president, Wallace was in many ways a forerunner of the modern vice presidents, who often serve as executive assistant and international emissary for the president. As Roosevelt planned to run for a third term in 1940, he wanted to revolutionize the role of the vice president and make the office into an additional set of eyes and ears. He sought someone who could handle administrative questions and large national policies without being a member of the cabinet. As an active Secretary of Agriculture and a committed New Dealer, Henry Wallace seemed the ideal person for the job. But Wallace's visionary social liberalism, his mysticism, his curiously shy and introspective personal demeanor, and his political insensitivity all prevented him from gathering the support from congressional leaders that would have enabled him to sustain a successful political career in Washington. Because few senators came to know Wallace personally, they often judged his character on the basis of his poorly delivered speeches and unusual appearance. Journalist Alan Drury, who observed the vice president often from the Senate press gallery, described Wallace as follows: "A shock of silver graying hair sweeps over to the right of his head in a great shaggy arc. He looks like a hayseed, talks like a prophet, and acts like an embarrassed schoolboy." Drury recorded sympathetically in his diary that he found it difficult to put into exact words the combination of feelings he arouses. The man's integrity and his idealism and his sainted otherworldliness are never in question. It's just the problem of translating them into everyday language and making them jibe with his shy, embarrassed, uncomfortable, good fellowship that is so difficult. Drury considered Henry Wallace doomed by fate. No matter what he does, it is always going to seem faintly ridiculous. And no matter how he acts, it is always going to seem faintly pathetic, at least to the cold-eyed judgments of the Hill. Youth. HenryAWallace was born on October 7th of 1888 near the town of Orion, Iowa. I almost said Ohio. An oddly appropriate location for someone who would become so fascinated with Oriental philosophy. Wallace was also deeply influenced by Iowa's rural culture. The agrarian lifestyle and communal society of turn-of-the-century Iowa formed his values, especially the idealism for which he is remembered. As a student at Iowa State College, he studied plant genetics and crossbreeding. He discovered and patented a successful strain of corn that produced a greater yield while resisting disease better than normal corn. This triumph allowed the young Wallace to found his own business to manufacture and distribute the plants, a venture that gave him valuable experience for his later career in public service. The future vice president was actually the third Henry Wallace. The first, his grandfather, had been a Presbyterian preacher turned farmer who became editor of the Iowa Homestead and publisher of Wallace's Farmer. These heavily read agricultural journals spread the Wallace name over the Iowa countryside and throughout the rural Midwest. The vice president's father, Henry Cantwell Wallace, served as Secretary of Agriculture in the administrations of Presidents Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge from 1921 until his death in 1924. HenryAWallace took over as publisher of the family journal when his father went to Washington, continuing in that role until he himself moved to Washington as Secretary of Agriculture in 1933. The Wallaces had traditionally been a Republican family, but the shock of the Great Depression and its impact on rural America forced Henry A. Wallace to reevaluate his political affiliations. Disgruntled by the Coolidge and Hoover agricultural policies, Wallace threw his support to the Democrats. In 1932, Wallace supported Franklin Roosevelt, who in turn selected Wallace as his Secretary of Agriculture. Wallace was born on a farm outside the village of Orient, Iowa, south of Des Moines, the third in an agrarian leadership dynasty of 3 Henry Wallaces. His grandfather, Uncle Henry, from whom Henry A. Wallace gained much of his spiritualistic bent, went to Iowa from Pennsylvania in the 1860s as a progressive minister in the United Presbyterian Church. But he later left the ministry for reasons of health and took up farming and farm journalism. With his sons, Uncle Henry took over a small farm journal in 1895 and transformed it as Wallace's Farmer into one of the leading farm newspapers in the nation. In 1921, his eldest son, Henry C. Wallace, took up the portfolio of Secretary of Agriculture in the Harding administration, and Henry C.'s son, Henry A. Wallace, trained in the agricultural sciences at Iowa State College, and already an international pioneer in corn hybridization, took over the editorship of Wallace's Farmer. That was Henry A., of course. You following all this? Henry C., Henry A., Uncle Henry. In 1914, Henry A. Wallace had married Elo Brown of Indianola, Iowa. Indianola. I believe that's how it would be spelled. Indianola. And his wife's name is ILO, so I believe it's Elo. Maybe it's Ilo. They had 3 children and were married for more than 50 years. It was in his editorials in Wallace's Farmer that Henry Wallace worked out the framework and much of the detail of the extensive critique of modern American culture that lay behind his social, political, and international affairs commentary of the 1930s and 1940s. In thousands of editorial columns and articles written between 1921 and 1933, Wallace presented social criticism analogs in many ways to that of various commentators of the era, liberal and conservative. The centerpiece of Wallace's perspective, framed by his spiritualism and his science, was a quintessential American communal philosophy. He developed a commentary grounded in Midwestern American agrarian values. Above all, he invoked the ethic of cooperation, a touchstone of 19th century agrarian politics in the United States. Around the notion of cooperation, Wallace fashioned an analog to the European constructions of socialism and communism, a vision of a different and, in his view, better American civilization based on ideals that he saw embodied in an increasingly threatened rural culture. Wallace's profound curiosity about the spiritual world led him, during the 1920s, to explore Hinduism, Baha'ism, astrology, and Native American religion. He focused the most, however, on the wisdom religion of Theosophy. Theosophy? I'm sorry, I think it's Theosophy. It is Theosophy. Theosophy, a belief system eminently suited to his philosophical intertwining of science and spiritualism. Wallace's attraction to the movement led to his involvement in something of a network of spiritualists by the early 1930s. The best known and most controversial of Wallace's spiritual associations was that with Russian émigré artist, poet, essayist, and theosophist Nicholas ROERICH. And it's émigré, Russian émigré. So Nicholas ROERICH was his name. In the 1920s and 1930s, ROERICH promoted an international treaty providing for the protection of the art treasures of all nations during wartime. The so-called ROERICH Pact became a reality in 1935 with Wallace, a champion of the pact and a member of Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet, as the signatory for the United States. At about the same time, Wallace, as Secretary of Agriculture, commissioned ROERICH to lead a Department of Agriculture expedition to Asia in search of drought-resistant grasses that might be of some benefit to the drought-ravaged American Midwest. The expedition ultimately collapsed in an embarrassing international relations controversy that arose out of some dubious political activities that ROERICH undertook while in China. Wallace contributed to the controversy by first defending ROERICH unquestioningly against various accusations of misconduct and then completely disengaging from him when it became apparent that the accusations were accurate. Secretary of Agriculture. An active Secretary of Agriculture, Wallace took to heart the needs and fears of his agricultural constituents. In addition to helping American farmers sustain themselves during the economic downturn, his Department of Agriculture oversaw the creation and development of the food stamp and school lunch programs that greatly aided urban America. In 1934, Wallace published a book about the economic turbulence of the Depression and its repercussions on farmers, which he titled New Frontiers. In it, Wallace outlined the visionary politics that he employed in his subsequent writings and speeches. Later, observers would compare both the title and the themes of this book with the ideas espoused by John F. Kennedy. Drastic times called for drastic measures. A firm supporter of government economic intervention, Wallace vigorously implemented the controversial measures of the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933. Never before in peacetime had the federal government sought to regulate production in American farming, with government planning designed to battle overproduction and lower prices. Additionally, Wallace offered hog and cotton farmers a single opportunity to improve their stagnating markets by plowing under 10 million acres of cotton and slaughtering 6 million pigs. For these losses, the government would issue relief checks totaling millions of dollars. Although it earned him the nickname the greatest butcher in Christendom, the program essentially worked, and the market experienced a 50% rise in prices. Wallace scorned those who ridiculed his plans without considering the logic behind them, observing, "Perhaps they think that farmers should run a sort of old folks' home for hogs." Having proved himself an effective, energetic cabinet member, Wallace remained in office through Roosevelt's first 2 terms. By 1940, with Europe plunged into war, there was talk of an unprecedented 3rd term, and Wallace was among those who endorsed the president's re-election. Because Vice President John Nance Garner, who aspired to the presidency himself, strongly opposed a 3rd term, Roosevelt sought a new running mate for the 1940 election once he made the decision to run. FDR's choice of Wallace marked a turning point in the history of the vice presidency. Never before had the president so openly made the selection. In the past, the main function of a vice president was usually to balance the ticket, to unite the party, and to pull in voters not normally drawn by the presidential candidate himself, with comparatively little attention paid to the compatibility of the 2 men. Presidential candidates generally acceded to the wishes of their party conventions in completing the ticket. Wallace first entered government as Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of Agriculture at the commencement of the New Deal in 1933. He moved quickly to address the desperate circumstances into which American farmers had slipped during the previous 12 years. Shortly after taking office, he called a national agricultural conference to determine what sort of emergency legislation to create. Wallace backed what was known as the Voluntary Domestic Allotment Plan, VDAP, a strategy he had advocated in various forms since the late 1920s. The VDAP called for controlling agricultural production by limiting the acreage of certain crops under cultivation in a given year. The aim of the legislation that contained the VDAP, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, of 1933, was to restore reasonable parity between the prices of farm products and manufactured goods. Farmers would voluntarily agree to produce less of various commodities and would receive in return compensatory payments funded by a special tax on companies that processed agricultural commodities. This would not only raise farm income in the short term, but by decreasing the overall supply of the specific commodities, raise agricultural prices over the long term as well. Wallace and his advisors intended to establish an agricultural system that would guarantee farmers a fair enough return on their production so as to enable them to function for the foreseeable future as consumers in the larger U.S. economy. The program was wide-ranging and controversial, and certain aspects of its controversy redounded negatively upon Wallace himself. This was particularly true regarding aspects of the AAA that in 1933 and 34 required large portions of the American cotton crop to be plowed under and thousands of baby pigs to be slaughtered in order to drive up cotton and pork prices. The destruction of the piglets was particularly controversial at a time when some 25% of American workers were without work and millions more were unable to provide themselves and their families with basic necessities. Although the administration made real attempts to distribute the surplus piglets and crops when appropriate, perceptions of the policy proved easily manipulable by Roosevelt's and Wallace's political opponents. Indeed, exaggerated allusions to the episode were used against Wallace from time to time for the rest of his public career. In fact, the policy of crop destruction was utilized only during the first year of the AAA, and in the case of wheat, was not necessary at all. The wheat allotment program worked from the start, greatly helped along by a drought that radically decreased the size of the American wheat crop, augmenting the effects of the AAA's policy. The results in wheat foreshadowed the overall relative success that the entire act attained. By 1936, farm income in the United States increased by some 50%, while farm debt plummeted by several $billion. In this sense, agricultural policies under Wallace's supervision arguably can be characterized as the New Deal's most effective. Also controversial was the AAA's impact on tenant farmers, particularly in the cotton agriculture of the South. Because the program decreased the need for farm labor, many tenant farmers were pushed off their land by owners who opted to put the tenants' acreage out of production. The AAA tried to moderate the effects, but at the local level, affairs were generally dominated by the landlords. The situation led to a battle within the AAA between liberal reformers and more traditional agrarians. In the end, Wallace was put in an untenable position, one over which he was deeply torn. He sympathized with the reformers, but acceded to the political practicality of the agrarians, including the need to maintain democratic support for the administration in the South. His ultimate and infamous purge of the liberals from the AAA in 1935 was the only way Wallace believed he could preserve support for the overall reform program. Despite being declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1936, a fate shared with many other components of the early New Deal, the AAA survived the New Deal era essentially intact. This was in great part due to the fact that Wallace and his advisors were prepared for just this, eventually having watched New Deal industrial policy succumb altogether to a negative Supreme Court decision the year before. Within months, virtually all of the AAA's components were recreated in constitutionally acceptable forms, and in some cases have remained in place to the present day. So now to read you guys just some more about his early life. We've already touched on this, but HenryAWallace was born on October 7th of 1888 on a farm near Orient, Iowa. I almost did it again with Ohio. It's unbelievable. I think it's because I say Orient, and then I'm just thinking, whatever. It's Orient, Iowa. He was born, of course, to Henry Cantwell Wallace and his wife, May. Wallace had 2 younger brothers and 3 younger sisters. His paternal grandfather, Uncle HenryAWallace, was a prominent landowner, newspaper editor, Republican activist, and social gospel advocate in Adair County, Iowa. Uncle Henry's father, John Wallace, was an Ulster Scots immigrant from the village Kilrea in County Londonderry, Ireland, who arrived in Philadelphia in 1823. May was born in New York City, but was raised by an aunt in Muscatine, Iowa, after her parents' death. Wallace's family moved to Ames, Iowa in 1892 and to Des Moines, Iowa in 1896. In 1894, the Wallaces established an agricultural newspaper, the Wallace's Farmer. We know this, of course. It became extremely successful and made the family wealthy and politically influential. Wallace took a strong interest in agriculture and plants from a young age, and he befriended African-American botanist George Washington Carver, with whom he frequently discussed plants and other subjects. Wallace was particularly interested in corn, Iowa's key crop. And in 1904, he devised an experiment that disproved agronomist Perry Greeley Holden's assertion that the most aesthetically pleasing corn would produce the greatest yield. Wallace graduated from West High School in 1906 and enrolled in Iowa State College later that year, majoring in animal husbandry. He joined the Hawkeye Club, a fraternal organization, and spent much of his free time continuing to study corn. He also organized a political club to support Gifford Pinchot, a progressive Republican who was head of the United States Forest Service. And as I had touched on a little bit ago, Wallace did become a full-time writer and editor for Wallace's Farmer after graduating from college in 1910. He was deeply interested in using mathematics and economics in agriculture and learned calculus as part of an effort to understand hog prices. He also wrote an influential article with pioneering statistician George W. Snedeker on computational methods for correlations and regressions. After his grandfather died in 1916, Wallace and his father became the co-editors of Wallace's Farmer. In 1929, Wallace assumed leadership of the paper after his father accepted an appointment as Secretary of Agriculture under President Harding. His uncle lost ownership of the paper in 1932 during the Great Depression, and Wallace stopped serving as editor in 1933. In 1914, Wallace and his wife purchased a farm near Johnston, Iowa. They initially attempted to combine corn production with dairy farming, but later turned their full attention to corn. Influenced by Edward Murray East, Wallace focused on producing hybrid corn, developing a variety called Copper Cross. In 1923, he reached the first ever contract for hybrid seed production, agreeing to grant the Iowa Seed Company the sole right to grow and sell Copper Cross corn. Say that 3 times fast. Copper Cross corn. In 1926, he co-founded the Hybrid Corn Company to develop and produce hybrid corn. It initially turned only a small profit, but eventually became a massive financial success. I'm not going to read all of this, but during World War I, Wallace and his father helped the United States Food Administration develop policies to increase hog production. After the USFA Director Herbert Hoover abandoned the hog production policies, the Wallaces favored the elder Wallace. The elder Wallace then joined an effort to deny Hoover the presidential nomination at the 1920 Republican National Convention. So basically, it was partly in response to Hoover. Wallace published an Agricultural Prices. It was in which he advocated government policies to control agricultural prices. He also warned farmers of an imminent price collapse after the war. This kind of goes just about what his early political interests were. Both Wallaces, meaning Henry and his father, who was also Henry, of course, they backed the McNary-Haugen Farm Relief Bill, which would have required the federal government to market and export agricultural surpluses in foreign markets. The bill was defeated in large part because of the opposition of President Coolidge, so we know that. Wallace's father actually died in October of 1924, and in the November 1924 election, Henry Wallace voted for the progressive nominee Robert La Follette. Due in part to Wallace's continued lobbying, Congress passed the McNary-Haugen bill in 1927 and 1928, but Coolidge vetoed the bill both times. Dissatisfied with both major party candidates in the 1928 presidential election, Wallace tried to get Illinois Governor Frank Lowden to run for president, and he ultimately supported Democratic nominee Al Smith, but Hoover won a landslide victory. The onset of the Great Depression during Hoover's administration devastated Iowa farmers as farm income fell by 2/3 from 1929 to 1932. And then, of course, in 1932, Wallace campaigned for Democrat FDR, who favored the agricultural policies of Wallace and economist M.L. Wilson. So that kind of leads us right up to his Secretary of Agriculture role. And, it really just touches on the fact we already, touched on when he was Secretary of Agriculture. He really kind of flipped because his family was very Republican. He finally went over and, decided to become a Democrat, support the Democratic Party. Obviously he strongly supported Roosevelt and Roosevelt's New Deal domestic program. And Wallace himself actually became a registered member of the Democratic Party in 1936. So, and then, as Secretary of Agriculture, the Supreme Court stuff, which was the United States versus Butler, which was the Agriculture Adjustment Act in the 1936. All this stuff we already read and touched on that. So that's pretty much it. 1935 is another little interesting fact. 1935, Wallace fired General Counsel Jerome Frank and some other agricultural department officials who sought to help Southern sharecroppers by issuing a reinterpretation of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. So that's kind of a little interesting note. I think that's pretty much it there. A Republican wave in the 1938 elections effectively brought an end to the New Deal legislative program. Blah, blah, blah. Not stuff I really, I'm going to dive too deep into because we already went over a lot of stuff here. So that's pretty much going to do it for the part 1 here, the early life, political rise, and just kind of his background. I mean, it's pretty funny to me and pretty interesting that I would be doing a vice presidential series video, and the main theme seems to be corn.
A glass. I'll have corn. I'll have more corn. Just say corn.
I mean, if I thought I was going to talk this much about corn, if somebody said that to me, I probably would have thought they were crazy. But yeah, I mean, Henry Wallace was really big into corn. So, pretty interesting stuff. That leads us all the way up to his vice presidency. We're going to touch on that tomorrow with part 2. Very cool, I think, that he was friends during his childhood with George Washington Carver. I think that's awesome. We're going to touch probably a little bit more on that tomorrow. I'm going to see if I can find some more information regarding that, if there's anything else out there, but still very cool. So there you go, guys. Part 1. Our look at our 33rd Vice President of the United States, Henry A. Wallace. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you so much for the support. Thank you for all you guys do. Keep it all coming. Can't thank you guys enough. And, of course, stay tuned for tomorrow, part 2. Also, real quick, no bonus footage. The only bonus footage you're going to see with Henry Wallace is my photos tomorrow at the end of part 2 when I visited his gravesite in Iowa. Other than that, I don't have any bonus footage for Henry Wallace. So I apologize there. But we will see you tomorrow for part 2, and we will get into the legacy and vice presidency and everything else with Henry Wallace. Thanks, guys. See you tomorrow.